Introducing David is Personal Genome Project staff member Michael Chow.
Thanks, Jason. Hi. Thanks, Jason. So yes, Mike Chow. I'm Director of Human Subjects Research for the Personal Genome Project, and I should now say the Harvard Personal Genome Project, which is nice to say because we now have multiple PGPs around the world. And it's my pleasure to introduce David today. David is an endocrinologist and a geneticist at MGH, and he's a founding core member of the Broad Institute, where he established and runs the Medical Population Genomics program, and genetics program, sorry. David's been critical in many projects that you're all familiar with, and we just heard a little bit about, notably the SNP Consortium, the HapMap project, the 1,000 Genomes project, and he's been involved in dozens of GWAS studies. One theme of David's research has been international and collaborative projects, and they're always inclusive. And recently David was recognized by the White House. Is that me? Must be. David was recognized by the White House for being a champion of change, due in part to a project I hope he will talk to you a little bit about today. And so please join me in welcoming David.
Yep. So thank you very much for that nice introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here today. I want to thank the organizers, George and Jason, and everyone for giving me the chance to speak at this meeting on genes, environments, and traits, things that are all close to my heart and organized by the Personal Genome Project. I guess I'm a little bit of a contrarian because I'm actually a technophile and known for my love of computers and data, but I guess somehow I decided to come and do it without any slides. I was given the rather daunting title of The Future of Genomics. I don't really think I can live up to that title, and if I wanted to know the answer, I'd invite George to give the talk, actually. But I will share whatever thoughts I might have on where we are and where we've been and where we're going, or we might go. I do want to start with just a moment of personal reflection, if I could, since I think all of us are here inspired by George. I first met George 25 years ago when I was an MD PhD student working on the same floor as George. I wasn't in his lab, but I was in the next lab over. And I now have, for the last 14 years, been on the same faculty with him in the Department of Genetics at Harvard. And I mention this because really it's absolutely true that I have often learned what the future would be, sort of dragged into the future by George's vision. And I remember the first time when I was in graduate school, I actually remember vividly, I have a strange memory. I remember vividly a meeting in the department where someone from George's lab described something that was completely incomprehensible to me, which I now in retrospect realize was proteomics. And literally I was like, what is Andy Link doing? And like 20 years later, like, oh, that's called proteomics. I get it. George was doing it 20 years ago. And but really, when I look back on the themes that are of my own scientific career, or ones that I may not be able to lay any claim to, but I follow with great interest: genome sequencing, computational biology, synthetic biology, now the crowdsourcing of biology. I really encountered those first from George, and I can't imagine that I would be doing what I was doing without George. And I would just finally say, and then I'll move on, you may not want to hear all this, but anyway, I wanted to say it in front of a group, that my experience of these things is typically that I don't understand them at all. Then I struggle to figure out what he's talking about, or think about all the things that might go wrong, because I think, I come at it sometimes from a different place, and then only later do I realize the essence of what George was talking about and how important it is, and then to say, okay, we should probably do that or contribute to that. So in the context of this meeting, I also want to call out how inspiring I find the enthusiasm and engagement of this community, and as someone who really does care a lot about sharing of data and information and what that can mean to the world and to the future of our personal knowledge and health, I think the commitment of the people in this group to pioneer new models of how to generate the information we need is really inspiring, and I celebrate what you've done. And not only, it's hard enough to have ideas like this, but to actually take them to the point where there's this data and information and all of the people paying attention is really a powerful thing. My own interest is in the use of genomics to improve human health. I think many people in this room share that interest. But I will say that I don't come at it actually primarily as a technologist, although I'm a technophile, or even as a scientist, although that's how I spend my time. My identity for whatever it's worth, is really as a physician. And my experience of this really comes from the intense experience that was really defining for me in terms of how I think about the world of being a medical student and physician then at Mass General Hospital. And what I took away from immersion for a period intensely of, I don't want to say how many hours a week because it's now illegal to work that many hours, in the hospital. But I came to some views that really shaped what I did. I actually was not a geneticist before that. I actually, as a few people in the room, Ting and George and others know, I actually was a developmental biologist. And it was actually the experience of working in the hospital that made me believe certain things that shaped what I did. And the things that I came to believe can be summarized as follows. One, for most diseases, what I learned at I hope, well, you can put this on TV, I guess I signed the form, but for most diseases, we actually don't have effective prevention and therapy. It's not just that we don't actually know exactly in whom to give it, we actually lack it. And for a number of things that as I'll describe in more detail, that we'd like to believe are true, the data when they have been tested actually is disappointing. Second, I came to believe, and this is sort of an enlightenment view of how the world works, that the most reliable path, not the only path, but the only really reliable path to improve prevention and treatment is a deep understanding of what causes disease and actually rigorous proof of benefit. And I'm going to expand on that in a minute. I came to believe deeply that correlation does not imply causality, and that genetics does offer a route to get at causality, but not all correlations have that property. I came to believe, not really back then, but after now 17 years trying to understand the genetics of complex traits, that human diseases are truly complex and polygenic and not reducible to single gene disorders in most cases, and no matter what combination of technology and analysis you put into them. And that finally, well-intentioned interventions can sometimes lead to bad outcomes. And that actually it's not enough just to sort of assume they work until proven otherwise, but actually you can do harm. The beginning of the Hippocratic Oath is first do no harm. So nonetheless, those are sort of the things that I came to believe were important. But because the number one on that list is that we have huge gaps in our knowledge of human disease and interventions that would help, and because I believe that those gaps were not being filled adequately by studies in cells and animal models, and because I believe that genetics and genomics actually do have special properties that allow you to get at causality, I'm hugely enthusiastic about studies. I've dedicated my professional career, as many of you have dedicated your energy and enthusiasm, to studies that aim to connect human genome variation, environmental risk factors, and human traits. And we've seen over the last 30 years tremendous progress identifying first single genes that explain so-called Mendelian diseases, nearly all of which are rare but very important in the people who have them, and more recently the genetic causes of more common complex diseases. And that latter topic has been what I've basically spent my life doing for the last 17 years, and my goal going into it was really to understand the genetic basis of complex diseases and figure out how it might work. And I have a view, and like surgeons, it's this line about surgeons that I'm sure is not true for the camera, but nonetheless joked, which is often wrong, never uncertain. So I will tell you I might be wrong, but I have a view. My view is that the genetic basis of diabetes and schizophrenia and inflammatory bowel diseases and other complex diseases, common disease I should say, is that their basis is truly complex and polygenic, meaning that many genes and environmental risk factors, as well as random chance, I'm not a determinist, contribute to each individual. And that is my view of the data, and now I think with the sequencing of hundreds of thousands of people and pedigrees and extremes, and all this data exists, although you'll note very little of it's published, and I'll get into why if you want, why it's not published, is that they're relatively, it's an exception more than the rule that you find a single gene of large effect that explains what's going on, and that this is not an issue now of technology because these samples have been sequenced. It's not because GWAS somehow didn't do the right experiment, and I don't personally believe, but you can never prove a negative, that it's because the analysis methods weren't done right, but I actually think it's how biology works. That's my opinion. And so in most of us, and for most traits, the world will not be as reductionist or predictive as sort of an extrapolation from Mendelian genetics might expect. And I'm sure that most people have their own opinions of this. Some of you will agree, some will disagree, and time will tell. But I think that it has profound implications for what we imagine we'll get out of this sequencing enterprise, is whether it's a matter of sort of technology and analysis and method, whether we get to be able to predict for most people most traits in some powerful way, or if it's in fact fundamental that they're just very complex. But the implication of this complexity, if you accept it, is that in order to learn, and I still think it's very much worth learning, I don't think complex things make them any less important or necessarily even tractable, that we need the largest possible sample sizes, we need the most accurate possible information on all genetic and environmental exposures we can get our hands on, and the most longitudinal and comprehensive and accurate data on phenotypes. And we also will need the most creative people and the best minds and methods around the world in order to make sense of this and to contribute to and analyze what can be learned. And that we also need to do this in a way that respects the diverse views that exist around the world on this very personal topic. So my sense is that the drive to create that world in which there will be all this data and we can learn from it is, I think, what animates the PGP and this conference. And I'm inspired by that. And I really do celebrate what you're doing because I think that it is a novel and interesting and powerful way to move it forward. And I think that at the same time, we'd all agree that there are many people around the world, because they may think differently than we do, or they may have a different life experience or a different set of assumptions, that they may have different views about what motivates them. We heard that slide, which was interesting, about, many of us are, I also have my Fitbit in my pocket, and I spend my life on genomics, and I like data, but many other people are motivated by other things, and I think there's always a danger in extrapolating from our own selves to other people without imposing our views on them. And I think that it's a sort of social good. It's almost an important aspect of all this, that we respect the autonomy of the individual as to how they think that they want to participate in this, and also their opportunity to benefit from it. And so my own takeaway from this is that we need a range of options. And I was once sitting in George's office when he explained to me his different things he was doing and how they were different models, for-profit, non-profit, and different open and closed models. And I think that's exactly what we need. Some people will choose to share all their information and collect it, and they will enable lots of other people, and they will hopefully benefit as well. Some people will choose to share some of their data, with lots of people and not others. Some will choose only to share with some people and not others, and some will choose not to share at all. And I think that that's what we should respect. I think there's a fundamental human rights aspect of this, which is of the autonomy of the individual to decide what's right for them. And I don't think there's any real tension between that and what other people choose to do. I just personally think that as important as sharing and data are as principles, I actually think there's a higher principle, which is the autonomy of people to choose for themselves what they think is in their interest and how they want to participate. One thing I do believe, and it was mentioned earlier, and I'll come back to it for a second, is that what's really needed is interoperability and understandable sort of way to navigate and exchange data. And I think the example of the internet and the World Wide Web are obviously examples of the power of being able to find and share information in interoperable environments, but also reliable ways to perform transactions, some of which are in the open and some of which actually have high levels of security and privacy attached to them. And all of us use our credit cards, and all of us go to bank machines and put our money, most of us, I think, in banks. And we rely on an infrastructure that allows you actually to track your information, share it with some people, not with others. And I think this all exists, and that kind of infrastructure is what we need in this field. And so that the inspiring idea, at least what now motivates and I think guides the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, which is now up to 175 organizations, and the PGP has joined, which we're very excited about, is to try and really encourage interoperability of approaches, not just for data, genomic data and clinical data, but also of ethics and security and privacy and other such things, so that then 1,000 flowers can bloom. And an interoperable world with varied levels of security and privacy, people can do whatever they want. And if there's only one view of how to do it, or if there aren't such interoperable things, we end up in silos. And I think that the really scary direction that we could go is U.S. electronic medical records, which I think is really just a disaster of sort of unimaginable proportions, where there's all this information, and you can be sick in one hospital in Boston and go across the street to a different one, sometimes in the same clinic, one office in a hospital and go to a different one, and not be able to share your information. And that's both a combination of technical, but mostly economic incentives and sort of social structures. And that's really, I think, what's needed to make this field take off. But the availability of the kind of information and also methods and data that this project has sparked are a big part of that. So I'd finally like to close with the last point I made, which is about the value and importance of rigorous testing of hypotheses about what interventions and changes actually make a difference, even when doing so might slow us down. And the reason that I raise this is the history in medicine of how rarely actually correlation has implied causality, and how often good ideas have led to bad outcomes. And so an example that has sort of shaped my views of this, and I'll just give one example, mention a couple, is the history of sudden death after heart attack. So the reason people are in hospitals and intensive care units after they have a heart attack is that in the immediate period afterwards, you're at a high rate of actually having sudden death. And the sudden death is because most typically you have an abnormal heart rhythm that causes you to suddenly die. And so around when I was in medical school, I remember this story of people setting out first to identify what might predict who would be at high risk of heart attack, and that prediction was based on collecting longitudinal digital data in the form of an EKG. And they found that having these funny heartbeats called PVCs, premature ventricular contractions, was associated with sudden death. And since the mechanism of sudden death was actually a long run of extra beats, and this was sort of sporadic extra beats, it really made a lot of common sense that if you could suppress the PVCs, you might suppress the sudden death and save lives. And there were people at the time, since there were some drugs that did this, who even argued that it was immoral or impractical to do these clinical trials because people might die while waiting for them and you would have that on your conscience. But nonetheless, the pointy-headed academic trials were done, and what they showed was actually increased death for people who took the medicines that suppressed the PVCs, because the biology and the medicine were much more complicated. And so the motivating idea made sense if the link between PVCs and heart attack was causal or simple, but it wasn't. And so thank God, in my mind, a rigorous trial was done, because you could imagine a long time of people being treated with these medicines and being killed before anyone would know. And the thing is, there are a lot of such examples in medicine of things that were done for a long time that weren't actually beneficial and we didn't know. So one of the examples is prostate-specific antigen in prostate cancer, where PSA testing is predictive of having prostate cancer, and under the logic that then removing your prostate would help you, millions of people have had that done, and it was sort of standard of care. And in fact, it was the case that the trials weren't done because it was considered immoral and unethical by a lot of people. It was hard to enroll in them, but they were eventually done. And when they were done, they showed absolutely no benefit to the people who had the early testing. But in fact, there's a very steady rate of incontinence and impotence, and not to mention the billions of dollars. So a lot of people were harmed, and it was difficult to demonstrate the help. So I mention these stories because I think that actually the sort of current focus on finding relationships in data between measurements and outcomes is really no different than any of these historical things. I think it's exactly what medicine has always done. And there's a long history of things that have benefited, and there's a long history of things that have actually not benefited or harmed. And there's no way to know up front which one will be which. And so, my own view of this is we should start from the null hypothesis, like we assume nothing works unless we prove it sort of can reject the null hypothesis, rather than starting from the proposition that the interventions are helpful until we sort of somehow get evidence that they're not helpful. And I realize this is actually different than how other people see it, and again, I believe in 1,000 flowers blooming, but nonetheless, I think that we have to be a little bit careful about that. So I'm going to close and just thank you all for, first of all, giving me the chance to talk. I've tried to just sort of share some of my own views, but most of all, I feel like the important thing is to learn more about human disease by studying people, their phenotypes, their environments, their genes. That's what this is all about. I'm a huge fan of sort of getting out there, trying new models, and inspiring engagement and sharing data, which is what you're doing. And I do sort of, my experience of the medical system is that unfortunately there's as much harm as good, and that we have to actually subject these things to rigorous testing, because if we don't, we won't really be on a solid ground. And there's nothing, at least for me, more important about this, that it ends up having some good in the world. So with that, I'll stop, and if there's time, take a few questions. Thank you. Someone in the back.
Hi, Juan Rodriguez, Weill Cornell. So given everything that's been discussed today and your experience in the field of genome-wide association studies, can you envision a GWAS or other type of genetic study where you would use this mobile technology to say, or all of your personal data from these people to take into account, let's say in diabetes or or obesity, things like how often does a person go eat at McDonald's or some other restaurant, and incorporate that into the genetic study as sort of a role to factor in the role of the environment?
Absolutely. So I think that's exactly the kinds of things that are needed. So the sort of easy part now, because of the technological transformation in genomics, will be to measure the sequence of the DNA. And the other things we need are better environment and better sort of phenotypes. And so I think that it's likely that we will get better estimates of what's going on if we can incorporate the different environments, the extent of activity, or the types of activity, or the times of activity, or any of those things. And that will come from the kind of devices you're talking about. Better measures of the environment would probably come from grid sampling of the environment, knowing what environmental risk factors are where, and then of course people having their GPS-enabled devices, so we'll actually know what environments they're exposed to, rather than sort of their self-report on a questionnaire or their zip code, which might not be what job they do or whatever. And then of course the quote-unquote disease, you're diabetic. If we had minute-to-minute measurements of your glucose, we might find that it's much more precise. All those things might be true. And they might not be true. It sort of depends. Like if you look at animal models and in studies, even in isogenic mice that have the exact same genotype except for one genetic mutation, in the exact same environment as best they can be fed the same cage and all this, and precisely monitored, there's a lot of actually mouse to mouse and cage to cage variation, which is randomness, because we're not determinists. And so I think that we will get better as we do all the things we describe, and to the extent that the things we can measure are in fact things that are in the causal pathway or discriminate phenotypes, I think they'll help a lot. And in some cases, one of the things that's happened in psychiatric disease recently is people in psychiatric disease used to argue we would only get to the genes for psychiatric disease if we made the phenotype more precise. But as GWAS studies and other studies have found genetic variants for psychiatric disease, a whole bunch of them have found across diagnostic categories. They affect schizophrenia, autism, epilepsy, and mental retardation. And so if you sort of imagine that when you find the genotype, now it affects one specific phenotype, that's a model in your head. It may not have that much to do with biology. The other model could be the genotypes affect many diseases, and the connection is different than that. Yes?
Does that mean that the reductive...
Does it mean that the reductive methodology that it's so prevalent in the current research may not be quite suited for this kind of complex problems that we're talking about right now?
It might mean that, but it sort of depends, I guess, what you mean by the kind of reductionist approach. I think if by reductionist approach what we mean is that everything must be in a complex Bayesian model and a full network model, that might help. But I think that, in my mind, the reductionism that I guess I would argue against is that very complex problems can be reduced to sort of a simple, one gene, one phenotype outcome. I just don't think that's how biology works. But it may be that the way we take it apart, and there'll be lots of strategies. My own strategy would be to find specific genes that play a role in with specific environments and specific disease outcomes, because we can build on that, not necessarily go straight to we have to have very complex models, but not imagine that we're going to find the one gene. And again, I think that's sort of a toy model. I don't think many people believe in that anymore. But not imagine we're going to read the genome and in each person for each trait find one predictive cause. I don't know, do we have time for another question, or should I don't want to go over? There. One more, right there in the front.
So given what we heard earlier today about what's going on in sports, I'm just a little curious. GINA was supposed to protect us from kind of employment-based discrimination, but what they're talking about with banning athletes based on predilection for heart, that sounds a lot, that's getting very Gattaca-esque, where it's like, we're not going to let you follow your dream because you might die and we don't invest a lot of money in it. Where do you think GINA is going to get revisited, or do you think there's going to be kind of like this, we're doing it for your own good? I remember like the cases of asbestosis, I think it was, or something where certain people were being told not to work in mines.
Right. So it's a really good question. I mean, I think that a lot of these things come down to economic interests, and also our society's very varied views, ranging from, and I won't take a stand on this, complete libertarianism to a regulatory state. And the picture I have, I didn't choose to show any slides, of my view of sort of genetics and whether or not we can harm ourselves by looking at our own genomes, which I don't favor regulating anyway, is that there are many states in America where you can carry a gun and an open, and you can drive a motorcycle without a helmet on, which has got to be more dangerous than looking in your genome. And there's and we will then take care of those people in the hospitals. And so my own view would be that there are liability issues. Like, it may be that I think it's legitimate for someone to say, if you were found to have a cardiomyopathy mutation that puts you at risk of a sports-related death and you choose to do it, you can sign some piece of paper, because I think there's an interest that the other stakeholders have in then not being blamed for something that you took on that responsibility. But as long as that's not necessarily the same as discrimination. Like, I think that we have a little complicated views in our society about freedom of people to do whatever they want, and then freedom of people to, sort of not hold accountability for that choice. So I wouldn't make it about do we let them play in the sports? I just say, do they really understand, are they prepared not to sue the school or sue the doctor when a predictable thing happens that they chose to ignore? But that's just my own views. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Speakers who are or not here. Yeah. And I hope that many of the conversations are continued for those who are staying in town tonight at restaurants nearby. There's one in the hotel, and there are many around here in Cambridge. So, and continue the conversation throughout the year and into the conference next year. So I think that particularly with the combination of Get Labs and Get Conference, we're really on to something special. And I hope that you all come back, and I hope that we also get a chance to spread this conference to other sites around the world, maybe geographically in other cities in the United States. And so I think that's something that we should discuss so more people who are unable to fly to Boston can participate in this. So thanks for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your day.